High in the limestone cliffs of the eastern Mediterranean, above the twisting banks of Amud River, lies a cave that once overlooked a very different world. Around 55,000 years ago, long before the rise of cities and civilizations, this cave gave shelter to one of the most enigmatic hominins ever discovered, a Neanderthal unlike any other. Known today as Amud 1, this tall, slender figure from the Late Pleistocene challenges everything we thought we knew about Neanderthals. Who was he? Why did he stand taller and appear more gracile than his cousins in Europe? And could he, as some researchers suggest, have been a hybrid, the product of an ancient encounter between two human species? The story of Amud 1 begins not in ancient prehistory, but in the year 1961, when archaeologists excavating the Amud cave unearthed an almost complete Neanderthal skeleton. The remains included a remarkably intact skull, upper body and partial legs. But what struck researchers immediately was the size of the individual. Most Neanderthals recovered from Europe rarely exceeded 165 centimeters, and they tended to be broad-chested and stocky, built for conserving heat in Ice Age climates. But Amud 1 was long-limbed, narrow-bodied, and strikingly different. With an estimated height of nearly 1.8 meters, 5 feet 11 inches, Amud 1 is considerably taller than any other known Neanderthal, and his skull has by far the largest cranial capacity, 1,740 cubic centimeters, of any Neanderthal skull ever found, making it one of the most famous Neanderthal specimens. His skull shape, too, told a curious tale. It retained many classic Neanderthal traits: heavy brow ridges, a large nasal cavity, and a long projecting mid-face. But the cranium was higher than expected, and the overall skull shape lacked the pronounced occipital bun typical of European Neanderthals. His teeth were large and robust, yet his jaw seemed less massive than those of his Western cousins. The result was a mosaic of features. Neanderthal, yes, but also suggestive of something else. Something more modern. Now let's delve into how the dominant out-of-Africa model historically shaped the perception of Amud 1, and how this model resisted the idea of hybridization until genetic evidence forced a radical rethink. For decades after his discovery, Amud 1 was seen through the lens of a rigid evolutionary framework, one dominated by the then ascendant out-of-Africa theory. This model, which gained widespread support in the late 20th century, argued that modern humans, Homo sapiens, evolved exclusively in Africa and replaced all other archaic human species, such as Neanderthals, without interbreeding. It was a theory of replacement, not continuity, and it came with powerful implications. Any other human species found outside Africa, no matter how sophisticated or unique, was relegated to a doomed evolutionary dead end. Amud 1, with his blend of Neanderthal traits and more modern features, was caught in the middle of this theoretical storm. His gracile form and tall stature challenged the stereotype of Neanderthals as squat, cold-adapted brutes. Yet because he lacked the fully modern cranial structure of Homo sapiens, he could not be included in the lineage of modern humans, as understood at the time. And under the strict out-of-Africa model, there was no room for ambiguity. Either a fossil was modern human, or it was a failed offshoot, a relic of an extinct species that had nothing to do with our story. This binary framework left no space for the possibility that Amud 1 might represent something more nuanced, a hybrid, a bridge between species, a signpost of intermingling rather than isolation. The idea that Neanderthals and modern humans could have interbred was widely dismissed throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Such notions were often labelled as romantic speculation, unsupported by hard science. In this environment, Amud 1's uniqueness was not celebrated, but instead flattened to fit prevailing assumptions. Anthropologists, constrained by the boundaries of taxonomy and theory, struggled to explain Amud 1's modern-like traits. Some tried to argue that he was simply an unusual Neanderthal. Others proposed that environmental factors might have shaped his physiology. But few dared to suggest that perhaps this individual was not entirely Neanderthal or entirely modern. To do so would have undermined the out-of-Africa doctrine that posited an unbroken African line of human superiority and progress. This resistance to hybridization wasn't just academic, it was ideological. Many researchers feared that acknowledging Neanderthal admixture would blur the neat, linear model of human evolution that was already taught in textbooks, a triumphant march from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens, with all other lineages conveniently culled by natural selection. To suggest that Neanderthals might have contributed to modern human ancestry was to challenge the purity of that march, and to raise uncomfortable questions about what it meant to be a modern human. But Amud 1 refused to fit the narrative. He lingered as an anomaly, an inconvenient truth that foreshadowed a scientific reckoning. That reckoning came at last in 2010, when a team led by Svante Paabo at the Max Planck Institute published the draft genome of a Neanderthal from Vindiga Cave in Croatia. The results were nothing short of revolutionary. Between 1 and 4% of the DNA in all non-African modern humans could be traced back to Neanderthals. The evidence for interbreeding was no longer speculative. It was written in our very blood. Suddenly, the entire framework of human evolution shifted. The rigid replacement model of out of Africa was forced to make room for a more complex story, one of contact, interbreeding, and genetic exchange. Neanderthals were no longer dead ends. They were ancestors. Their legacy lived on in the immune systems, skin adaptations, and even behavioral traits of modern humans. And in that new light, Amud 1 began to shine brighter than ever before. The Amud 1 facial skeleton was incomplete and fragmentary. Its assumed form has been reconstructed, so the specimen's measurements, particularly the midface, are speculative. In fact, a virtual reconstruction revealed that the Amud 1 facial skeleton was smaller than previously thought, and the cranial vault was shorter and more brachycephalic during the individual's lifetime, having been deformed in situ by geological pressure. Aside from that, even a cursory examination of Amud 1's face would call into question any claims based on its properties, as its incompleteness is clearly a potential source of misinterpretation. Thus, for example, its nasal cavity, of which only the inferior part has survived, cannot be reconstructed. All measurements must be approximated. Nonetheless, according to these rough estimates, Amud 1's nasal aperture is as similar to those of various archaic Homo sapiens specimens as it is to those of certain classic Neanderthals. The reported measurements appear to correspond more with a view of these traits as primitive rather than modern Neanderthal traits. Amud's postcranial skeleton is as distinct as its cranium, and it differs from that of Neanderthals and modern humans. Its upper and lower limb bones are long, in stark contrast to the shorter bones and typical proportions of the supposedly cold-adapted Neanderthals. Its estimated stature is quite tall when compared to classic Neanderthal males, and it is similar to school males and the Kafsa population. The curvature of its radius shaft is slight, but not as pronounced as in European Neanderthals, and its upper limb bones are gracile rather than primitive. Indeed, some of Amud's so-called archaic cranial features are also found in modern populations. It shares characteristics with not only Neanderthals and modern humans, but also Homo erectus. According to one study, Amud 1 has the most classic Neanderthal facial features. This claim contradicts the acknowledgement that Amud is intermediate in certain facial features between Neanderthals and modern humans. In other ways, Amud 1 is distinct from both European Neanderthals and Shanidar 1. The problematic nature of this claim is further demonstrated by the fact that re-evaluation of the morphological data for Amud 1 reveals that it lacks many of the distinguishing Neanderthal characteristics. Its cranial height is greater than any of Middle Paleolithic man in Europe and Western Asia, and nearly the same as those of Upper Paleolithic skulls. Its supraorbital torus is more similar to that of School 4-4 than to those of Neanderthals and Shanidar 1. In terms of frontal angles, the frontal bone's inclination falls somewhere between Neanderthals and Upper Paleolithic man. Amud's temporal bone contains its most modern cranial features. The high border of its temporal squama is as curved as in modern humans. Its well-developed mastoid process is similar to modern humans in shape and size, but differs from that of classic Neanderthals and Shanidar 1. Therefore, the examination of Amud 1's morphology, rather than providing significant support for the claim that it corresponds to the Neanderthal pattern, clearly establishes its dissociation from this category. Reinterpreted in this post-genomic era, Amud 1 was no longer just an unusually tall Neanderthal. He was a key to understanding the true nature of human evolution as a braided stream, not a single trunk. His unique features, once seen as anomalies, now made perfect sense if he or his ancestors had been part of a hybrid population. The Levant, after all, was a known zone of overlap between Neanderthals and early modern humans. Genetic exchange there was not only possible, it was probable. But perhaps most importantly, Amud 1 stands today as a reminder of how scientific orthodoxy can delay discovery. For nearly half a century, the dominant theory blinded researchers to the full implications of his anatomy. Rather than entertain the idea that he might be a hybrid, many dismissed his unusual form as aberrant or environmentally induced. Only after genetic evidence forced a shift did researchers return to Amud 1 with fresh eyes and realize what they had missed. His story reveals that the truth of our past is often more complex than our theories can contain. It teaches us to remain open to ambiguity, to listen to the evidence even when it doesn't fit our expectations. In Amud 1's tall, gracile bones, there is a message, not just about Neanderthals or hybrids, but about the humility required in the search for human origins. To understand Amud 1, we must place him in his time, a period of dramatic ecological and evolutionary upheaval in the Levant. Around 55,000 years ago, the region was a crucial corridor between Africa and Eurasia, a place where populations of archaic and modern humans repeatedly passed, settled, and disappeared. The Levant was a fluctuating boundary zone, a land of mingling species. It was here that Neanderthals met early Homo sapiens and possibly interbred. Amud Cave lies in the Upper Galilee, a lush, seasonally temperate region during the Pleistocene. It was not the frozen steppe of Ice Age Europe, but a dynamic woodland landscape where gazelle herds roamed through forested hills and freshwater springs provided sustenance to ancient foragers. In this verdant refuge, Neanderthals had adapted not to cold and snow, but to a mild Mediterranean climate, favouring mobility, long-range hunting, and a different physical form. This environmental context may partially explain the unusual morphology of Amud 1. Living in a warmer climate, he did not need the squat, heat-conserving body plan of European Neanderthals. His taller frame and longer limbs suggest adaptation to thermoregulation in a milder or even hot climate, much like the lankier physiques of modern humans from equatorial regions. Yet that cannot fully explain the surprisingly gracile traits, such as a thinner jaw, reduced brow, and rounded skull. These are not merely climatic responses, but may reflect genetic input from another population. It is this blend of traits that fuels the theory that Amud 1 was a hybrid, possibly the descendant of a Neanderthal and an early modern human. The timing aligns perfectly. We know from fossil and genetic evidence that modern humans first entered the Levant at least 100,000 years ago, with sites like Skul and Kafza yielding fossils of early Homo sapiens dating back to 120,000 to 90,000 years ago. These early incursions into the region appear to have vanished, possibly driven back by climate change or competition. But some scholars suggest that these first Homo sapiens may not have disappeared entirely. They may have interbred with the Neanderthals, who later reoccupied the region during colder phases. Amud 1, then, could be the product of that ancient genetic exchange, a living bridge between species. His body, built for grace rather than brute strength, may reflect an evolutionary blend. Supporting this view are later genomic studies of Neanderthals and modern humans that confirm interbreeding occurred multiple times over tens of thousands of years. While no DNA has yet been extracted from Amud 1 himself, other Neanderthals from the region, including those from Kebara and Shanidar, display dental and skeletal traits that suggest a broader variability than their European counterparts. The Levantine Neanderthals were not clones of their Ice Age kin, but a unique, diverse population, possibly shaped by contact with modern humans. What was life like for Amud 1 and his kin? Archaeological evidence from the Amud site reveals a relatively sophisticated Neanderthal culture. Stone tools, many Mousterian in type, were found alongside his remains, including scrapers and points used for hunting and hide preparation. The cave also yielded fragments of animal bones from deer, gazelles, and even bears, indicating a diverse diet and mastery of the surrounding environment. Some researchers believe the tools show signs of regional innovation, suggesting that Neanderthals in the Levant were experimenting and adapting to new challenges. Even more tantalizing is the possibility that Amud I was buried intentionally. While not all archaeologists agree, the position of the skeleton, nestled in a shallow pit, and the presence of tools nearby have led some to propose that Amud I was laid to rest deliberately. If true, this would imply symbolic behavior, an awareness of death, ritual, and perhaps even mourning. Such behavior is often seen as a hallmark of modern humans, but here again, Neanderthals demonstrate that they were not the mindless brutes once depicted in early 20th century science. The implications of Amud I's features are profound. If he was indeed a hybrid or even partially descended from earlier hybrids, then he provides living testimony to the fact that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were not separate in every sense. They were part of an interwoven story, two branches of humanity that occasionally intertwined. And more than that, he shows that the Levant was a crucible of human evolution, where lines blurred and identities merged. Over the decades, Amud I has inspired debate and re-evaluation. Early researchers were hesitant to call him a full Neanderthal due to his gracile build and high cranium. Later studies, especially those comparing his skull to European Neanderthals, have confirmed that despite his unusual shape, he shares a suite of core Neanderthal traits, making him unquestionably part of the species Homo neanderthalensis. But he remains an outlier, a reminder of the species' surprising flexibility and diversity. Today, with the aid of modern imaging techniques, 3D reconstructions of Amud I have helped bring his face to life. These reconstructions, combining skeletal geometry with knowledge of Neanderthal soft tissue patterns, reveal a man with a broad, expressive face, less heavy-set than the popular image of the Neanderthal, and perhaps more familiar to our modern eyes. He may have walked upright with the same grace and gait as us, with long strides and agile limbs. What he thought, what language he may have spoken, what stories he shared around the fire, these remain unknown. But his bones tell us he was not alone. Other Neanderthal remains have been found at the Amud site, including infants and children, suggesting a thriving community. These individuals, too, display a range of traits, hinting that the Neanderthals of the Levant were not genetically isolated, but open to change, open to contact. Could Amud I have fathered children with modern humans? Could his descendants have contributed genes to both Neanderthal and Homo sapiens lineages? These are questions still awaiting answers, perhaps locked in the DNA of ancient fossils yet to be found. But Amud I gives us a model, an example of what might have happened when two kinds of humans met not in war, but in alliance, perhaps even in love. As the sun sets over the Galilean hills, casting golden light on the cliffs above the Amud River, it's not hard to imagine him standing there watching the world shift around him. He was tall, he was graceful, and he was part of a species long thought to be rigid and doomed. Instead, Amud I shows us that Neanderthals were not frozen in their European moulds, but evolving, adapting, and reaching outward. In his bones, we find a story of movement, mingling, and the shared origins of us all. Indeed, it has been argued for at least a century that there was interbreeding between modern humans and Neanderthals, a claim that was dismissed by the dogmatic out-of-Africa theory in the 1980s. Though the out-of-Africa theory originally fiercely defended the idea that modern humans were a pure human that descended from a small population and then spread out, replacing all other human species, we now know that the real story is much, much more complex.